Hello and welcome to the December 2020 podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and my guest this month is Jerome Karabel, who's Professor of Sociology at the University of California at Berkeley. Jerry has an article in this month's paper entitled Trumpism Will Outlive Trump, which warns against complacency in the wake of Biden's electoral victory. Yes, Biden defeated Trump, but, Jerry writes, the Republican Party is now firmly in the hands of Trumpists and likely to remain so for the foreseeable future. Despite the pandemic and the damage it has done to people's health and the economy, Trump secured 10 million more votes than in 2016. Even if he doesn't run again in 2024, and there are indications he might, he will seek to be kingmaker. What if his successor learns from Trump's mistakes, espousing his ideology, but implementing it much more ruthlessly and effectively? A US Viktor Orban, if you will. We'll return to that prospect. But when I spoke to Jerry last week, I began with a point he makes in his article. At the start of this year, pre-pandemic, a second term for Trump was still an entirely realistic possibility.
Yes, I think it's very important for people to remember that absent the pandemic and the economic dislocation that followed from the pandemic, we might well be looking at another 4 years of Donald Trump as president. I think while the evidence is not definitive, various indicators suggest that Trump might have been on the road to re-election.
That, I think, might, perhaps particularly people who don't live in the United States, that might really surprise people, given all that we learned about Trump, all the things that were mishandled before the pandemic. It seemed a completely dysfunctional administration. So people might well wonder, how on earth could he have been, poised at least for a potential second term?
I think the key thing to realize is that the electorate is extremely polarized, and that Republicans generally are going to vote for Republicans no matter what. Democrats are going to vote for Democrats no matter what. My standard joke on this is that basically any Democrat to the right of Lenin is likely to get a vast majority of Democratic votes, and any Republican to the left of Genghis Khan is going to get a vast majority of Republican votes. And so I think that's the foundational piece of the election. Apart from that, though, Trump actually had some genuine popularity. There were particular subgroups he was genuinely popular among. I would say white evangelicals, for sure. I would say rural voters, to a great extent, very supportive of Trump. I would say a lot of working class voters, especially white working class voters, but not just white working class voters. Some working class Hispanic and African American voters as well were supportive of Trump. He was running a very populist campaign, anti-elite. There's a lot of animosity to the American elite. I think much of that is justified for historical reasons. And I think it's important to point out that what Trump did better than prior Republicans is he targeted the cultural and political elites, not the economic elite. And there is great antagonism toward cultural and political elites among a lot of Americans who feel like their interests and values have been neglected by them. And so Trump, I think, had a genuine broad appeal. Never quite a majority appeal, but close to a majority appeal.
And retained that.
Retained that, and in some ways even strengthened it. As I think most people who have followed this know, he received 7 million more votes than he did the last time. And his percentage of the vote increased slightly from 46 to 47%. So he was not that far from winning the election, even in the aftermath of a catastrophic pandemic and unemployment at a level that hadn't been seen since the Great Depression.
So the weekend, I think it was the Saturday after the election, we saw pictures of fireworks and people celebrating in the streets and horns blaring and so on. And I guess for a lot of people, there was a sort of sense of a collective sigh of relief at that point, a sort of sense that the 4-year nightmare was coming to an end. Something aberrant, an aberrant chapter in American history was going to be closed come the inauguration in January. And I guess your article is a sort of quite a salutary warning against that sort of, risk of complacency of thinking, okay, well, we suffered under Trump, that era is now over. You would say to those people, not so fast, don't form too hasty a judgment on that.
Well, in fact, if you look at the overall returns in the election, they actually are in some ways very troubling for Democrats. That while Trump was defeated, that at every other level, the Senate, where the Democrats expected to regain control, they did not. At the level of the House of Representatives, they lost at least 10, probably more seats. And in state legislatures, the latest figures show they lost 179 seats. So many people voted against Trump. They found him too much to tolerate, but they didn't necessarily embrace the Democrats. So the Democratic Party overall is, if anything, in a somewhat weaker position than it was prior to the election. And they are at real risk not only of not winning the Senate, which will be resolved in a special election in Georgia where two people could swing it narrowly to the Democrats, but in the 2022 elections, they could easily lose the House of Representatives. In fact, they are likely to lose the House of Representatives if past patterns hold, where the incumbent president loses seats in the House of Representatives. So first of all, Biden does not have control of the key parts of the legislature. And secondly, the prospects that he will have such control in 2022 are somewhat dim. So what this means is that whatever Biden's agenda might be, he will have great difficulty enacting it.
Particularly as I'm sure we'll come on to talk about what he is inheriting in terms of the economy and the health crisis. I just wanted to ask, in passing, when we're talking about Trump, there is speculation about a Trump bid for re-election in 2024. Should we be treating that as at all a serious proposition, or is it the realms of fantasy?
I'm afraid it may not be in the realm of fantasy. I think what is likely is that Trump will keep his options open, will, at the very least, pretend that he is either planning to run in 2024 or is seriously considering it. And the reason I think he will do so is, first of all, he craves attention, excuse me, and that will maintain attention. Secondly, it is a money-raising device. So I think the likelihood that Trump will withdraw from politics is very low. Whether he will run in 2024 is unclear. I think it's far too early. So in 2024, at least if you look at current polls, the Republican primary electorate much prefers Trump over any alternative possible candidate. For example, Vice President Pence or Nikki Haley, who is ambassador to the United Nations, or a number of lesser candidates. So if Trump wants the nomination, it could well be his. So I'm afraid while many would like to think of him as buried in the past, he probably is going to be in the present and near future, and possibly will come back in 2024.
So even if he is not coming back as a presidential candidate, as you say, he remains a likely political force. And that, I guess, raises the question of what does Trumpism minus Trump at the forefront, even if he's a significant player, what does it actually amount to? Because we've got so used to everything being about Trump in the last few years, about his tweets and his whims and his tantrums and his everything about his sort of personality and its ups and downs. So if we sort of extract him from being the front runner as a Republican presidential candidate, what actually remains of Trumpism?
I think Trumpism is a relatively coherent ideology. I would say its essence is American first nationalist populism. I would say that is absolutely at the heart of it. So it is no coincidence that he withdrew from the Paris Accord, that he withdrew from the World Health Organization, that he withdrew from the Iran agreement. So I would say that would be the foundational feature of Trumpism. Following from that, I would say, is an animosity toward globalization and toward the institutions and treaties that embody globalization. So, for example, the World Trade Organization, the WTO, the NAFTA agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was ultimately blocked. So it's animosity to these trade deals. I would say, in addition, a third feature would be animosity to especially illegal immigrants, but not just illegal immigrants. In addition to that, there's a kind of populist, anti-elitist element focused on waging kind of cultural wars, and that has real resonance with segments of the population. There is also a kind of dog-whistling racism, which was not incompatible with small gains in support among Hispanics and African Americans. Right. But I think for traditional American racists, they hear the dog whistles and they hear them loudly and clearly, and they respond to them. So I would say those are some of the foundational features of Trumpism, but I would also note what it is not. It is not traditional republicanism that is hostile to key elements of the welfare state. So it does not call for privatization of Social Security. It does not call for privatization of Medicare. So in that regard, it bears a resemblance to certain nationalist right-wing movements like Le Pen's movement in France, which are not anti-welfare state, but are nationalist, xenophobic, and implicitly or explicitly racist. So I would say all of those components come together under the umbrella of a kind of nationalist American firstism imbued with a kind of populist, powerful undercurrent. So I think it is unlikely that the Republican Party will revert to its traditional small government, anti-welfare state elements, although what is interesting about Trump in power is that, in fact, he embraced much of the classical Republican agenda of deregulation, of lowering taxes, and certainly with respect to the courts, he appointed an unprecedented number of right-wing judges, which I think the entire Republican Party was quite happy with. So he made his peace with the Republican Party, but he also in many ways made it his own.
That is a huge political shift, isn't it? Because I think the establishment of the Republican Party began in 2015, 2016, not taking him seriously, thinking of him as an aberration. It sounds as though they've made their compact with him now.
I think they've not only made their compact with him, but I think some of the smarter younger Republicans, and I would cite Senator Hawley of Missouri and Senator Cotton of Arkansas, recognize that Trumpism has an appeal that traditional republicanism lacked, and they are attaching themselves to a kind of Trumpism without Trump.
That, I guess, is something that they are drawing from the election result that we've just seen last month. What about the Democrats? What lessons do you think the Democrats need to draw from the result we've just seen?
I think the Democrats should draw the lesson that they won the presidential election by the skin of their teeth and that they are vulnerable in future presidential elections. If you look at the Electoral College, the peculiar institution that determines who is president in the United States, although the Democrats won by roughly 4.5% in the popular vote, they came perilously close to losing the Electoral College. And one of the things that the Democrats need to remember is that in order to win the presidency, it is not enough that they get more votes. They need roughly 3 to 6% more votes than the Republicans to win. And it was entirely possible this time with the shift of, I think, fewer than 100,000 votes in 4 key states, we'd now be looking at a second Trump term. So that's the first lesson. The second lesson is that they are really lacking in appeal to large segments of the working class. This is a problem that center-left parties are having throughout the Western world, but it's particularly pronounced in the United States. So you have this paradox where a party that historically, going back to Roosevelt, was considered the People's Party, the party of ordinary folks, low, working class people, people who are relatively low income. And now many of those same people are voting for Trump. So you have an odd class inversion where the richest congressional districts in the country are now overwhelmingly Democratic, and most of the poorest districts are Republican. This is a problem that if the Democrats don't address, they're going to run into serious difficulties in the future. But thus far, they've not only been unable to address it, but they have embraced the strategy of trying to get affluent suburban voters more or less writing off working class voters. That is a problem that is not unique to the Democratic Party, but it is a particularly serious one for future political prospects. There also is another problem, which I think they are aware of, and that is that the Hispanic population, which has often been misunderstood as another, quote, people of color constituency that would naturally gravitate toward the Democrats, that in fact, roughly 4 or 5% more Hispanics voted for Trump than in 2016, which to many people was shocking because of the overtly anti-Mexican rhetoric that he opened his campaign with. But many Hispanics or Latinos, depending on how you refer to them, see themselves primarily as Americans and as working class, not specifically as Latino. And also racially, many Latinos consider themselves white. So I think the easy assumption that the Democrats have had that demography is on their side and will naturally lead to a Democratic majority in the future, that looks increasingly untenable. And so that's an area that they need to attend to. And I think there is a recognition that they have a problem. And I think a failure to recognize the extraordinary heterogeneity of the Latino population, I think is serious. One minor element, but which I think speaks to larger issues, is that in the United States, there is now a new term used among the politically enlightened referring to Latinos or Hispanics as Latinx, Latinx, which is a gender-neutral term. Probably 95% or more of Latinos or Hispanics find this a peculiar term that is being externally imposed on them by that same cultural elite that Trump is always denouncing. So I think it's an interesting piece of the kind of culture wars that may have redounded against the Democrats in their attempt to be woke, politically woke.
I mean, the conclusion is it's dangerous to lump people together and presume they will act in a particular way because of their ethnic origin. And the Democrats have perhaps been over-reliant on broad categories of the American electorate and thinking that they were in the bag.
Yes, and I think the first step, which is recognizing there's a problem, has already occurred. How they address the problem remains to be seen.
That's harder. So, I mean, moving on to January and the inauguration of Joe Biden. I mean, Biden, in many ways, is a known quantity, isn't he? He's been in American political life for decades. He served as Obama's vice president for 2 terms. Does his past give us a sense of what he's going to be like as a president, albeit in exceptional circumstances? Can we sort of predict how he's going to take to the stage in January?
I think we can not only predict, I think we have some clear indications from the appointments he's made so far. He basically is a centrist, center-left Democrat. He's not far from Obama at all, or Hillary Clinton for that matter, or Bill Clinton. However, he recognizes circumstances have changed. So he's moved ever so slightly to the left. At the same time, he has not appointed a single person from the Bernie Sanders wing of the party. So I think we can see he's going to try to walk a middle, ever so slightly left of center. He's going to follow that position. And I think he is an institutionalist and a traditionalist. He will try to reach compromises. He will try to be bipartisan. If and when that doesn't work, and I think it's unlikely to work, exactly what he's going to do is not clear. He does have the capacity to do certain things via executive order that are not dependent on the Congress. But I do think he is very clear that the 2 issues he most wants to address are the pandemic and the economic crisis. And I think on the pandemic, I think a little bit of competency and a little bit of rationality will be a welcome change from the Trump administration. And I think he has the good fortune to be coming into office just as vaccines are becoming available. And so I think there is the possibility that he will get on top of the pandemic, that within 6 months, possibly less, It will be mostly behind us. And I think the plan, the hope is that he will get credit for that. And so that may strengthen his position. With respect to the economy, I think if the pandemic recedes, that will be conducive to an economic recovery. It seems as if a stimulus package of relief may be passed later this month that would improve the economy a bit when he comes into office. His plan is to pass an additional package when he becomes president. I'm uncertain and skeptical as to whether he will be able to do that. But I think those are the two big issues. He has a fairly clear plan. If he succeeds in one, and especially both, his political position will be strengthened. Now, there are things that he could do that would be very popular, but I think he lacks the audacity to do them. So one example would be an excess profits tax of the sort that was passed during World War II. And various studies have indicated now that since the pandemic began, America's billionaires have increased their wealth by $1 trillion. So a wealth tax, an excess profits tax on those people would bring substantial revenue. It would be extremely popular politically. The likelihood it would get through Congress, I think, is modest, but I think Biden would benefit politically if he would forcefully advocate an excess profits tax. But based on his history, on his traditionalism, on his caution, I would be frankly surprised if he were to do that.
And how would a move like that play, Jerry, with the big donors who gave to his campaign? It was very noticeable just how well-funded the Biden campaign was. And inevitably, there must be expectations attached to what a Biden presidency would do for those big funders. It couldn't simply be about ending the chaos and unpredictability of the Trump era for big business, could it?
No, although I think that one of the things that the big donors are looking for is stability and competence and predictability. And so Biden probably will bring those things. I think they would be very unhappy if he imposed a serious excess profits tax. I think they would be very unhappy if he were to make the tax system radically more progressive, as many Democrats have proposed, and as even he has suggested he would like to do. I think they expect of him a return to globalization, probably a return to trade deals. They expect no particularly vigorous regulatory initiatives, especially with respect to big tech and probably with respect to Wall Street. So I think they do feel that there are lines that should not be crossed. And I would be surprised if Biden were to try to cross any of those lines, which means that the Sanders-Warren wing, I think, will be quite unhappy. And so the internal tensions within the Democratic Party, I think, are going to soon be revealed as very intense.
Jerry, in conclusion, I wanted to ask you, you raise in your piece, I guess, the nightmare scenario of an American Viktor Orban. In other words, someone who combines the right-wing ideology of Trumpism with a real zeal to implement that ideology on the ground, to implement it in practical political decision-making. A, you see that as a genuine risk, and B, do you see candidates waiting in the wings who might conceivably be ready to step into that role in the coming years?
I do see that as a genuine risk. I think that Trump was in many ways incompetent. And Trump, in addition, was personally offensive to a lot of people, especially highly educated people, many of them residing in the suburbs. So someone who espoused the positions that Trump espoused without the personal baggage and the personal offensiveness, and who was far more disciplined and far more strategic, would be very, very dangerous. So I don't see anybody on the horizon right now who combines his charisma with discipline and personal appeal. However, some such person could appear, if not in 2024, than subsequently. So I think this is a real threat. Of the various people who are waiting off stage right now, I would say Josh Hawley of Missouri is the one who perhaps worries me most. He's a very peculiar populist in that he went to private school, then Stanford, and I believe he may have been a Rhodes Scholar, and then he graduated from Yale Law School. But his posture is of man of the people from center of the country who is taking up the cause of the working class and who is opposed to the cultural elite. So he certainly has discipline and he has intelligence. I think what he lacks is personal appeal. But the absence of any person who combines those qualities now is absolutely no guarantee that such a person won't appear on the horizon sometime down the road. So I do think it would be a big mistake to basically say that with Trump's disappearance from the scene at some point, that Trumpism and what it represents is behind us. It may come back, and it may come back possibly in an even more toxic form.
I was talking to Jerome Karabel about his article, Trumpism Will Outlive Trump, which is in the December 2020 edition of Le Monde Diplomatique. It's available at mondediplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can read every edition of the paper going back over 20 years, as well as exploring other resources such as maps, images, the podcast archive, and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of content online to entice you to become one. In the words of the late John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again soon for another interview with one of our contributors. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.